Hello, my name is Ben Woodworth, and I am the Director of Training for the Iowa Association of Community Providers. I'm pleased to be able to spend some time with you today to talk about brain injury and its impact on employment. First, a little bit about our association. The mission of the Iowa Association of Community Providers is relentlessly advocating for Iowa's providers to build healthy communities. The association works with over 135 community-based organizations across the state of Iowa. Those organizations are in all 99 counties and serve approximately 140,000 of Iowans who experience disability, including intellectual disability, developmental disability, brain injury, and mental health issues. Those providers employ about 30,000 folks across the state, which has an impact of about $1.3 billion on Iowa's economy. Those are dollars that continue to stay in Iowa and go to Main Street, Iowa, in many small communities. A little bit about what we're going to discuss today. The topic of brain injury and employment is a very complex topic, and so we're only going to be able to get into some minimal pieces in terms of topics today, but we'll cover the incidence and prevalence of brain injury both across the country and here in Iowa, the definition of brain injury in Iowa, according to Iowa Administrative Code, brain injury and behavior relationships, brain injury and its impact on cognition, cognitive challenges after brain injury, and then talk about some resources that you can use for further help as you work with folks. A little bit about the annual incidence rate of traumatic brain injury in the United States. Traumatic brain injury has often been, is a subset of what's called acquired brain injury. The definition of traumatic brain injury is an injury that results from an outside physical force causing injury to the brain. This is the number that is most commonly used and measured by the CDC. The CDC estimates that 1.7 million traumatic brain injuries occur in the United States annually. Of those 1.7, 136,000, or 52,000, result in death. 275,000 of those people are hospitalized, and 1.3 million result in emergency department visits. They are not and unable to measure the number of folks who receive other medical care or no medical care after their injuries. This may include folks who have concussion, which has recently received a lot of notoriety around a variety of different sporting events, but also concussion is, in its definition, mild traumatic brain injury. Then we look at the annual number of traumatic brain injuries in Iowa as measured by the Iowa Department of Public Health. The Iowa Department of Public Health is the lead agency for brain injury in the state of Iowa, responsible for epidemiological data and also responsible for administering the Brain Injury Services Program, which helps to fund part of the work the association does around helping people with brain injury, and also the Neuro Resource Facilitation Program with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. The department estimates that about 17,000 traumatic brain injuries occur in Iowa annually. 540 of those result in death, 1,600 result in hospitalizations, and 15,000 of those result in emergency department visits. There is no data on concussion and mild traumatic brain injury for folks who don't enter into the healthcare system. Interestingly, the CDC estimates that about 5.3 million people live with long-term disability as a result of traumatic brain injury in the United States. This group would represent a group as large as the population of the state of Colorado. So there's a significant amount of people who live with long-term disability as a result. Long-term disability being defined as challenges in one or more areas of independent living. brain injury here in Iowa, to cut into those statistics we talked about a little bit, 2,700 folks are hospitalized each year as a result. And based on the CDC data, we can extrapolate that about 50,000 Iowans, or 2% of the population, live with disability as a result of brain injury. In Iowa, men are more likely to be injured than females, at about a 60 to 40% ratio. And those injuries that men have are more likely to be severe. This is secondary to the fact that males are more likely to engage in risk-taking behavior, and those risks can lead to more severe brain injury. Iowans over 65 are most likely to be hospitalized secondary to brain injury, and those under 15 are most likely to be seen in an emergency room. When we start to talk about the mechanisms of brain injury, the number one cause of brain injury in the state of Iowa is falls. And the second most likely is motor vehicle crashes. The third being a category called struck by or against, which includes assaults and violence. And currently we have no data on the level of concussion that occurs here in Iowa, although we are fortunate to have some partnerships that have existed with high school athletic associations, in which we do have return to play regulations and requirements in place that help to protect our young athletes who participate in high school sports. Brain injury is defined in Iowa in two places in Iowa Administrative Code. Both of those pieces of administrative code match. This is the Administrative Code 8381, which is under the Department of Human Services under 441. And the definition of brain injury as written is: brain injury means clinically evident damage to the brain resulting directly or indirectly from trauma, infection, anoxia, vascular lesions, or tumor of the brain, and that's not primarily related to degenerative or an aging process, and temporarily or permanently impairs a person's physical, cognitive, or behavioral function. This is also consistent with the definition that's utilized by the Iowa Department of Public Health, who is responsible for measuring data regarding brain injury. So we have matching definitions within the Department of Human Services, who's the primary funder of state funding for services and supports for people with brain injury, as well as the group that collects the data within the Iowa Department of Public Health. Underneath this definition, it lists a listing of ICD-10 diagnoses that qualify as brain injury. And if you reference this code, you'll be able to find those and understand what those are. So today we're going to talk a little bit about traumatic brain injury in terms of what are the problematic consequences. This is a statement from the National Institutes of Health in 1998, and interestingly, the consensus statement was developed, I think, in January of 98, and really looked to say, how do we better serve folks with brain injury? How do we work to help folks from the perspective that traumatic brain injury is a significant public health problem? And this was one of the statements from the title page of that document. It's about a 150-page document that was written at that point in time by leaders in the field in all areas in terms of measurement and in terms of rehabilitation for folks with traumatic brain injury. And it says, although traumatic brain injury may result in physical impairment, the more problematic consequences involve the individual's cognition, emotional functioning, and behavior. Interestingly, since that time, we have become better at dealing with the physical impairments, and we're able to accommodate for many of those physical impairments. The areas that really keep folks from being successful in getting to where they want to be in terms of their day-to-day lives is really the cognitive, emotional functioning and behavior. And this is especially true with folks who are working towards returning or gaining employment. Cognition, emotional functioning, behavior consists of many of those soft skills that people need to be successful in the employment arena and can get in the way of them being able to be successful. Now, we won't go in and do an exhaustive neuroanatomy lesson today, but I do want to talk a little bit about the four lobes of the brain and the cerebellum, and talk a little bit about how they impact people in terms of what we see and in terms of how it might impact their interpretation of environment and their ability to react in that environment. When we use the term behavior, we're using it with the definition of brain behavior being response to stimulus in one's environment and to one's context. So we'll talk a little bit about how each of these areas can impact somebody in terms of their ability to become successfully employed. Occipital lobe, which is represented in the green on the screen at the back of the brain, the lower back portion, is the main center for vision. Vision being a very complex process of taking in stimulus through the eyes. Those impulses then travel through the optic nerves, which cross approximately a midbrain, what we call the optic chiasm, and then come into the occipital lobe for those things to be processed and to have make sense. Vision is a very important process, very complex process. We see a lot of folks who have visual difficulties after brain injury, regardless whether it might be field cuts, whether it might be the inability to manage and focus the eyes. These things can make it very challenging for folks to engage in activities that might have small type, small text, may make certain physical environments challenging to navigate, and a variety of other types of things that could lead to some type of misadventure. So, but occipital lobe is mainly responsible for vision and can also impact, like I said, a variety of different pieces. The parietal lobe is responsible for then a lot of what we would call perceptive pieces. People, all of the senses are processed. Those stimulus are processed in the parietal lobe, except for smell. It allows us to differentiate size, shape, and color. And it also allows for folks to be able to access visual and spatial perception. So that is where objects would, in terms of space, where those objects are, etc. So kind of start to see that the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe share some tasks in terms of vision, and they also blend together in terms of one having more of a primary focus on vision and the secondary, and then the parietal lobe having some secondary functions that allow for higher level visual processes. The temporal lobe, which is represented by the blue on the lower central part of this diagram, is responsible for many of the functions in terms of memory. Also, those pieces around encoding, storage, and retrieval, memory being a very complex process that we'll talk about a little later on. But then also the actual physical portion of hearing and understanding or receptive language. Understanding language is a very key process. Language is obviously the way by which, the dominant way by which most of us communicate. And so being able to take in the language that's being shared, process it, put meaning to it, and then able to utilize it effectively is a function of the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is also responsible for organization and sequencing, being able to take things and organize them into groups, then being able to possibly plan for activities or to engage in an activity that may require a specific sequence. The temporal lobe is responsible for many of these functions. Then we move on to the pink area of the model, which is represented as the frontal lobes. Obviously, the frontal lobes includes both the prefrontal cortex as well as a variety of other pieces, but this is a fairly simplified representation of the brain for today. Frontal lobe has many functions, what we would call higher level executive functions. The frontal lobe is also the most vulnerable area of the brain. The frontal lobe is seated, as you can see here at the bottom, near the inside of the skull, the inside of the skull being somewhat rigid and bony and has protrusions that during a forcible injury, such as a whiplash, such as a car crash, stopping suddenly could cause the brain, which is suspended in cerebral spinal fluid, the frontal lobe of that brain to crash against the front of the skull, which can cause significant areas of shearing and tearing, which can cause swelling, also interrupt the neural pathways. And so the frontal lobe is recognized almost universally as the most vulnerable area of the brain. Unfortunately, it's also one of the areas that we need most intact for folks to be successful in employment. It starts to look at things like problem solving, judgment, inhibition of behavior. Many of those skills that folks need to be effective in a work environment, mental flexibility, being able to switch mental sets when a task deviates from norm, and then the ability to use expressive language. Frontal lobe is also responsible for some interplay with the temporal lobes in terms of memory. And so that, because memory is a multi-lobe process, we see many folks who have problems with memory after brain injury. The frontal lobe is also responsible for inhibition of behavior, impulse control, and many of those things that can lead to, as we read earlier, some of the behavioral consequences that can be problematic for folks as they attempt to adjust to new normal in their lives and work with people who maybe aren't aware of their injury or aren't aware of the implications of their injury. So now we'll talk a little bit about cognition and what cognition is. Cognition being another point of emphasis in the statement by the consensus group. Simply stated, cognition is a person's ability to think. It includes the ability to choose, understand, remember, and use information. Information being used fairly broadly in this statement in terms of in someone's environment, the stimulus that is being offered, using that information to act upon that information. Understanding that if somebody interprets information in their environment in a different way than we do, that it's only natural that they would react differently than we do. And this is the crux of traumatic brain injury, is that the person's ability to either understand, remember, and use information has been impacted. And so they're acting on a different set of stimulus than most of us in certain environments. Some of the general cognitive skills that we'll talk about today, and we won't get into challenging behavior after brain injury today. That's a pretty significant area in terms of impact, and it's also a significant area in terms of the amount of information we would have to share to be able to effectively speak to it. One of the pieces is that as part of the program here with the Iowa Association of Community Providers, we're able to offer in-person trainings and work with teams individually on folks, with folks who have challenging behavior, whether that be challenges in cognition or aberrant behavior, able to work with folks effectively to help folks effectively navigate those environments. So the cognitive skills that we'll talk about today include attention and concentration, processing information, memory, communication, planning and organization, problem solving, and decision making, and controlling impulses. If we were to put these side by side by the things that folks need to be successful with in terms of employment, I would venture to say that each one of these has a significant impact on somebody's ability to be successful in an employment situation, whether that be as an employee or through self-employment or through business management. Each of these processes, when impacted, can have different types of impact, negative impact on folks and their ability to successfully maintain and keep employment. Attention and concentration. It can be that folks after brain injury are distracted by normal levels of activity, which may make working in specific environments challenging, environments that have a high threshold in terms of noise, many different activities going on, multiple activities going on, might start to distract somebody, maybe cause them fatigue, may cause them to become angry, may cause them to become anxious. So this difficulty with attention and concentration can be seen as in terms of difficulty with attending, but then also over attending. So inability to discriminate stimulus in the environment and be able to attend to the stimulus at hand. Having difficulty, obviously, following managing multiple tasks. So attention and concentration is a real piece. The other piece is that attention and concentration play a significant role in memory. One of the first steps of being able to engage in the process of memory is being able to attend. If you don't attend to information initially, it can be extremely difficult, or if not impossible, to recall that information. And so attention and concentration is a key piece. Folks may be, because they're not attending or having difficulty attending, may interrupt. They may have difficulty managing multiple tasks. They may have difficulty managing tasks that have multiple steps in them, and may lose track of where they are in a process, may have difficulty with quality control, and just a variety of different things that obviously would be important to somebody being successful in an employment arena. After brain injury, processing information can be a challenge. Many folks may take longer to understand and process verbal information. We talked earlier that processing or taking in receptive language is impacted by the temporal lobes with some frontal lobe involvement. So it may take them longer to actually engage in being able to process and act on the verbal information that's being shared for them. It may take longer to understand and follow directions. There may be a latency period between the time at which information is shared and the time the individual acts on that. That period may be significant for many people, which can lead to people resharing information and challenges in terms of people being able to act on that. It can lead to frustration on the individual's fault. It may take longer to read for written information and comprehend that. So the entire process of being able to take in language and process and then act on that can slow significantly for folks. We also see that in terms of some of the physical pieces, is that folks' ability to act on physical stimulus in their environment may be slowed. which can put them at risk for injury, which can also slow down their ability to carry out a variety of different physical tasks. So processing information is an issue. There's many strategies that can be put into place in terms of making information, turning it into usable chunks, being able to write out multiple step directions for people, offering cues in terms of what next steps may be, giving folks a little bit longer to process information, or the ability to reprocess information, and a variety of different accommodations that can be used. Memory is probably the most common issue that folks report after traumatic brain injury. Memory being a very, very complex cognitive process of being able to recall previously learned information. The challenge with that being, as we saw earlier, if you have difficulty with attention, and memory really being the process of being able to take information in, to encode it, to store it, and then retrieve it. For memory to be useful, for learning to be useful, we have to be able to encode the information in a way that we can store that information, and then being able to, at the time it is needed, recall that information. If any of those steps is impacted, memory will be significantly impacted, and it will significantly impact an individual's ability to recall what they've previously learned. This goes from things such as novel as people's names, to directions that they might have learned previously, steps that might need to be taken, memory both short and long term. Typically, we see more short term, the frontal lobes being responsible for some of that working and short term memory. And as I mentioned earlier, those are the most vulnerable areas of the brain, as we see many people who have challenges with short and working memory and short-term memory after their injuries. And so folks who have those difficulties are going to need numerous exposures to new information, and definite strategies that they should be working with an allied health professional to start developing a strategy by which to either compensate for memory or to redevelop some of those skills and rehabilitate some of those skills after an injury. People may have difficulty following schedules. They may blow off appointments. Unfortunately, for a lot of folks after brain injury, in work environments at times, in treatment environments, in a variety of different environments, challenges with memory can be attributed to volitional behavior, is that somebody didn't come to an appointment because they didn't care enough about it, or they didn't remember somebody's name, and that this is something that the person is actively doing. But memory difficulties are real, and they're real for folks for a significant portion of folks who've experienced brain injury. And so it's important to understand a person's specific challenges that they may have with memory. This could be achieved by looking at a neuropsych eval, speech language pathologist eval, and understanding, okay, this is the specific deficit we see in terms of memory. How could this play out in terms of this person's ability to be successful in their chosen place of employment? I think it's important to also recognize that just because somebody may have a specific challenge in terms of memory, that it doesn't preclude them from being in certain environments. What it means is that we have to find different ways to accommodate them. Typically with brain injury, secondary to the fact that memory is so challenging, the supported employment or replace and train model for folks with brain injury is the most effective. It's very difficult for folks to generalize learning from environment to environment. That's one of the mainstays that we see with folks who've experienced brain injury. And so being able to get them in the environment in which they'll be functioning and develop those accommodations and strategies is the most effective way to help them be successful. Communication. We talked about the frontal lobes and the temporal lobes. The frontal lobes being responsible for expressive communication, and the temporal lobes being responsible for receptive communication. People can have challenges and difficulties in both of those areas. It may be hard for somebody to express their thoughts. They may have difficulty finding, with word finding, ascribing the right word to the thought that they're having, difficulty receiving language, understanding the language that others are using. Now, this is a discrete piece in terms of, is it a processing issue or is it a receptive communication issue? Receptive communication differs from processing in terms of if an individual with a processing disorder is given the information, they're going in another or a slower format or more easy to understand in terms of the information that's being shared. They'll be able to understand that. With communication difficulties, individuals may not be able to ascribe actual meaning to the words that are being utilized, and so. And that may be regardless of the words that are being utilized. And so it may be very difficult to communicate with folks. Two types of challenges that folks have are expressive and receptive aphasia. I'm not going to go significantly into those today. It's not the purpose of this presentation, but understand that communication can imply itself, again, in a variety of different ways in terms of employment. It may be difficult for somebody to work with coworkers or with the general public if they have significant communication difficulties. It might be difficult for them to understand or take in information from the public in a front-facing type of position. They may have difficulty with what they share with the public. And so understanding that maybe finding the right fit for somebody who has these communication difficulties while they work on remediating those may be a good piece in terms of being able to put them in a place to be successful. So folks may engage in speech that rambles. Their nonverbal communication may not match what they're expressing. That disconnect between what we see non-verbally and what we hear verbally. Wow. Okay, so planning and organization. These two skills obviously are important both on a day-to-day basis in terms of life for folks and also in terms of how it will play out with them in a work setting. They're looking and saying, I may have difficulty planning, or I have difficulty following a daily schedule. How do I start to put myself in a place where I can start to order my day? What you'll see is people who make decisions that aren't consistent with what you hear from them in terms of what they want to do in terms of goals. I'll just use a really easy example. Somebody may be in a position where they work at 9 in the morning. They know that because of their injury, they need 10 hours of sleep. And they may have the difficulty with planning and forward looking in terms of when they should go to bed the night before. And that's a very simplistic example. One easy way to work with this is to start to work with folks backwards. If you work at 9 in the morning and you need 10 hours of sleep, that takes us, and I'm a social worker, so forgive my math, takes me a minute here. But if you need to drive to work and it takes a half an hour and it takes an hour for you to get ready, you need to be up at 7:30. So we need to then go to bed 10 hours prior to 7:30, which would be 9:30. But sometimes for folks, they're unable to create that path to success or unable to work backwards in terms of organizing their schedule, in terms of planning to be effective. They may not have the ability to anticipate the consequences that will come as a result of a decision now versus how it will impact things that go on in the future. This can be a real significant issue for folks in terms of both their day-to-day lives and also their success in employment. Folks do need access to different planning and organizational devices. The one thing I would caution against is I've worked with multiple people, and not every, and this is actually as good a time to share this as any. When you talk about working with folks who've experienced traumatic brain injury, if you've worked with one person with brain injury, you've worked with one person with brain injury. That is one of the actual interesting pieces and compelling pieces about working with folks who've experienced injury, is that everybody's set of cognitive deficits is different, and everybody's preferences and ability to accommodate those is different. And so no one intervention works across the board. Many years ago, it was a dominant school of thought that folks had to have memory books, that this would improve their memory and would also be able to be used for planning an organization. They were 3-ring binders, but not 3-ring binders don't work for everybody. And just like anybody in the general population, myself included, you who are listening today on this webinar, we plan and organize our days differently. We have different preferences. I happen to use multiple systems. I have a to-do list that's very concrete. I have a calendar that's in multiple places. It's finding that system that works for me. And as much so as it is for us to be successful, we may need to have multiple unique systems. So do folks who experience brain injury. Not every intervention is going to fit someone, and it oftentimes is being pragmatic in our pursuit of looking and saying, what's a preference? How does this work for you? What have you used in the past in terms of planning an organization? What have you been effective with in the past? What are things that you feel comfortable using now? What are the environmental constraints around somebody? If we have a planning and organizational system, but we can't access it, then that planning and organizational system wouldn't be effective for someone. And so it's really important that we're catering our interventions, that we're working with folks to ensure that the intervention is as unique as the individual that we're looking at serving. Problem solving and decision making is another issue. This is that set of skills that allows folks to take in new novel stimulus and make decisions upon it. People may have difficulty with analyzing the information, challenges with mental flexibility. So doing the same thing, but and arriving at the same unwanted outcome. So that inability to shift mental set, the inability to say, I've come up with choice A or B, I chose B last time, it didn't work, and then choosing B again. Unable to use information or new information that might be available to shift that mental set, to be flexible mentally and make new decisions based on novel information. Unable to arrive at a conclusion on what the best decision might make. So the inability to look and weigh pros and cons in a situation may be a challenge for folks. May secondary to impulsivity, make quick decisions before considering all the information that is available to them, or exhausting and looking at all the options that may be available for a certain situation. They may also have difficulty identifying the actual problem to be solved. So being able to understand this is the issue that I need to deal with now, or quite frankly, ordering how problems should be dealt with in a descending order. So obviously this, for folks who are in different any workplace setting, quite frankly, most of us need to be able to take in information, act on it, and solve problems actively, because not everything is going to go in the same order or the same route every time, and being able to act on those decisions. There's a variety of different things that can be done in terms of working with folks to compensate for this, a variety of different strategies. One of the ways that we work with folks on both cognitive and behavioral issues is called personal intervention planning. And it's working with individuals in a really very person-centered way to develop plans that work effectively for them, unique plans that work for them, starting to look at some of those compensatory strategies, blending in supports that they may need in their environment, both formal and informal supports, and looking at how they can be the most successful. Fortunately, the collaboration that happens through the development of those puts folks in a place where they're more likely to utilize those rather than possible staff-centered or staff-planned interventions. Controlling impulses. People may be unaware of the impact their behavior has on the people around them. Interestingly, when we talk about impulses, everybody experiences impulse. Typically, though, for those of us that are considered neurotypical, our frontal lobes typically discriminate those impulses and whether or not we act on those. As I mentioned several times throughout, the frontal lobes are if not the most vulnerable area of the brain, most likely to have damage and impact, and responsible for controlling impulses. So therefore, we see a significant amount of folks who have difficulty controlling those impulses. Now, just imagine for a moment, as you kind of are watching this webinar, is you might have had a variety of different impulses during the entirety of this. And you've either chosen to act on them or not, based upon a variety of different factors. But basically what's happened is your frontal lobes has engaged in some high level and complex executive processes to decide whether or not you're going to act on that impulse or whether you're going to quell that impulse. If you were to act on those, you may end up saying on things that were not typically considered socially appropriate. You may exhibit behavior that has a lack of awareness of social boundaries. You may make sexually suggestive comments. These are all things that we see common with folks who have difficulty controlling impulses. Interestingly, this is one of the areas that gets folks into a place of misadventure in many, many workplaces. It can make workplace relationships, both with coworkers and with a boss or something like that, very challenging. It can make difficulty working with the general public. It can put folks in a place where we have difficulty, have difficulty understanding why they're behaving in a certain way. Can also lead to folks who have anger when they become frustrated or ashamed and the inability to control that anger. So this is a significant area for folks, regardless of employment situation. Again, we use personal intervention planning to work with folks to successfully self-manage those behaviors. The impulses are not going to go away. We just want to put folks in a place where they can successfully manage those on their own. The reason we're so adamant about using personal intervention planning is that it is a self-developed way to manage behavior that can also be utilized from environment to environment. So it's a set of skills that we can generalize from environment to environment, which is very difficult for folks. So what we're doing is we're taking something that develops a skill that we're using in multiple environments and that somebody's taking with them. Developing a skill through what we would call traditional behavioral programming in environments that are contrived or not real doesn't often work itself well in terms of transferring skills into other environments. Personal intervention planning, which is a piece that we offer a significant amount of training and discussion of, is the most effective way that I have found and that a variety of us have found who've done this for a significant amount of time in terms of working with somebody to control their impulses. So why does all this cognition matter? In terms of employment, it matters because it impacts how individuals interact with their environments and in situations, and it gets in the way of people getting where they want to go with their lives. And that, I think, is really the end game. When we work with folks with traumatic brain injury, we're working with them. There's a significant difference between acceptance and adjustment. We're really working with folks to adjust to a new normal in their lives and understanding their injury, understanding the cognitive impacts, understanding how those cognitive impacts apply themselves in situations such as employment, where folks want to get back to work. They want to be able to be to re-engage in some of those socially valued roles. They want to avoid being in poverty. All those things the wonderful things that come out of being actively employed. But it also expands their social networks and the amount of social capital that people have. And one of the things we know that folks with brain injury experience is a lot of social isolation and a lot of social difficulty. So employment is a significant part and an important part in a person with brain injuries path towards that discovery of new normal. But it's also on the contra side to that, many of the cognitive impacts can impact how somebody interacts in environment in different situations, and so can ultimately get in their way of achieving that goal of employment. As part of this webinar, and this concludes the webinar, as part of this webinar, there will be 2 resources that will be available. One, contact information for resources here in Iowa that are available. Both the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa and the Iowa Association of Community Providers work significantly with the Iowa Department of Public Health to increase the service system capacity to serve people with brain injury across the state. The Iowa Association of Community Providers has a training and consultation program that's available to providers, including case managers, community-based service providers, and providers in a variety of multiple systems, as well as the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa having what's called a neuro resource facilitation program, which is aimed at supporting families and individuals as they navigate the system. So as part of this webinar, there'll be a resource on that with further contact information for you as you go forward working with folks. Also, we'll be including the Employer's Guide to Understanding Brain Injury. This was a resource that was created by the National Model Systems on Traumatic Brain Injury, specifically the program at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Iowa is a very active partner with the clinic in terms of working to develop resources that are translatable into community-based services for folks. This resource is a great resource in terms of helping employers to understand some of the struggles that people go through and putting it in a very easy to understand format. It is a free resource that is available in electronic format, and it'll be one of the pieces that's available secondary to this webinar. So I thank you for listening today. I hope that this basic primer has been helpful. And if you need further information, please find the contact information and contact myself or someone at the association or someone with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa, and we'll work to get you to a place where you get the help that you need. Thank you.